Thanks, Carrie and Sophia, and good morning, church. We are here with Pastor Daniel, and I'm, of course, Nathan Sliwa, and we're going to continue our Bible study about the genres of the Bible. So we've spent the 2 weeks before Easter going through all of the books of the Old Testament. I'm getting this crash course. I'm supposed to go to seminary in the fall, so I'm trying to learn everything now. So before I take my 101 courses, I'm getting the Bible for Dummies.
This is like a 101 in undergrad kind of style course, right? It's like an introduction to. Yeah. So it should lead right into.
This is my level right now. This is so we're starting with the New Testament today.
Yeah, we finally got here.
Yeah, finally. So of course, do we need any more introduction before we get to the four biggest books of the Bible?
No, but if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and Nathan will monitor that. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I am monitoring the chat. I will ask your questions. They can be hard-hitting. Pastor Daniel has all ears right now. So
that's right. We're getting a little tired of talking to an empty room. So please give us your questions.
Okay, so the Gospels.
Yeah, so we're going to start with the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the heart of the Bible for us as Christians, and particularly for us as Lutherans. Martin Luther said that the Bible is like a cradle that holds the baby Jesus. And what he means by that is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are by far the most important things that we read. When we read the Gospels in church, we always read a gospel. We always make you stand up for it because it's the part of the Bible that we most value. The Gospels are basically the story and life and teachings and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what we called the synoptic Gospels. That's because they tell a synopsis. You know what a synopsis is?
Synopsis is like a summary.
A summary of the story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptics. John is not a synoptic. And there's a very big difference between those. So if you had what was called an interlinear Bible, it would show you Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side by side. Okay? So say the rich man coming to Jesus. That's in Matthew 19, and I think it's in Mark 10, and it's in Luke 10, okay? Mm-hmm. So that one story is in all three. So a synoptic would show you where they come from. Mark is the original of the Gospels. Mark is the oldest. That's pretty much well known. We know that because Luke and Matthew both borrow from Mark. Like, they'll write for a while and tell their own story, and then there'll be like 3 paragraphs in a row that are straight from Mark, and then they'll add in stuff like that. So there's some stuff that's original to Matthew. We call that M. Mm-hmm. There's stuff that's original to Luke. Guess what we call that? L. Then there's stuff that's original to Mark. We call that the source. And then there's stuff that's in Luke and Matthew that's not in Mark. Are you with me?
Yeah.
We call that Q.
Okay, that's a little bit of a deviation there.
I know, but what's really funny about Q is it's a theoretical document. Mm-hmm. So like there was a Q source.
Yeah, so you're just talking about how you label the source material of the Gospels.
Right. Yeah. So but they're exactly the same in Luke and Matthew, which means it's not like they both heard the same story from different people. Mm-hmm. They had the same text in front of them. But what's great is you can get a PhD in the Q source as a theoretical source. You can write a whole dissertation about a document that may or may not have ever existed, and I really think that's great. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the story of Jesus and his ministry that takes about 1 year. He starts with his baptism in Mark's gospel. He starts at 30 years old. So we know that that's the source because in general, when they edit, they don't take things out, they add more stuff on. And the easiest place to add stuff on is in the beginning and in the end. Mm. So Mark's gospel starts with Jesus' baptism and ends with an empty tomb. There's no post-resurrection Jesus floating around like the story we read today about Jesus appearing to the disciples. In Mark, it starts with the baptism and it ends with the empty tomb. Now, this causes some people to say that Jesus didn't rise from the dead because Mark would have recorded it. That's not a good way to read Mark. Mark would not have written the gospel if he didn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, right? So he leaves it a little bit as a cliffhanger because he doesn't want to theologically try and understand how Jesus can be resurrected. So Mark leaves it there to sort of let your own imagination catch up. Matthew and Luke write after Mark. So if Jesus dies in 33, let's say, Mark's gospel gets written in about 70, and Matthew and Luke write in about 75. Luke is a paid writer. He's Greek, which means he's got a really good understanding of the Greek language. So Luke is very poetic. Matthew is very much of an Enneagram 1, okay? He loves to follow the rules. So everything that Jesus does or says is in conversation with the rules. When he breaks the rules, when he likes the rules, when he tells you, I came not to abolish the law.
And Enneagram 1s love following the rules.
Enneagram 1s love the rules. And Jewish culture, right? The 619 laws of the Old Testament. So Jesus' interactions with his disciples, with Pharisees and all that, it's all about, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So Matthew is this rubbing up against Jesus and his new platform on, say, working on the Sabbath and the Jewish notions of that. So Matthew is the one that I read the least. I find it to be very pessimistic. It's the one that people quote when they want to say there are people who are in and out, and I'm in and you're out.
Who's the audience for Matthew?
So that's a great question. The audience for Matthew are Jewish people who are now also Christians. So in a Venn diagram, the people who overlap. Okay, Jewish Christian.
Yeah, we have a question from Susan.
Yeah. Hi, Susan.
To tell us a bit about the different perspectives of the gospel. So we're kind of going through that.
Yeah, you probably heard me say this before, but in general, I say Mark is the realist. He wrote it so that it would all fit on one scroll, okay? So I really appreciate that about Mark. The word that Mark uses more than any other is the word immediately. So Jesus is baptized. Immediately, he heads into the desert to be tempted. Immediately, he leaves and goes somewhere else. Immediately. And Mark's gospel is the shortest, so I always call Mark the realist, okay? There's no fluff. There's no theology. There's no repeating of words other than the word immediately. Matthew, I tend to call the pessimist. He's the one he's trying to hold on to Jewish law, so it has a lot of separating, which is what kosher law is. If you know anything about kosher, you know you have to separate. I can use this sink for meat, and I have to use this sink for dairy. I can use this pot for meat, etc., right? It's a lot about separating. So what's Matthew's gospel about? We're going to separate the sheep from the goats. We're going to separate the wheat from the chaff. But people read into that judgment.
Almost like in some way, like we've been functioning with our faith by following rules.
For hundreds of years.
And so let's see how we can do that in this new way.
That's right. So it also has a lot of sort of the prophecy of he's the heir of David. So Matthew has, don't quote me on this, but like 80 references to Old Testament prophecy, like baked in, right? So that every time Jesus does something, you're like, oh, that's what was in Isaiah. That was in Ezekiel. And sometimes Matthew's like drops those names. He's right. And then Jesus says, for it is written. That's Matthew. Luke is, and I'm biased here. I mean, I think we're all biased, but Luke is the optimist. And you can tell by what Jesus says on the cross in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? In Matthew on the cross, and Mark on the cross, all he says is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay? He's a realist. That's what he said, done. Matthew quotes that, but then makes him say it in Hebrew, right? My God, lema shabbatni, or whatever it is.
Eli.
Yeah, right.
Lema
shabbatni.
I read it last week.
Yeah, right. So Matthew's like, oh, we're going to have Jesus say this same one pessimistic line, but we're going to make it extra Hebrew, right? Even though he speaks Aramaic, right? And then Luke, Jesus talks for a long time on the cross. He says, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." The thief is next to him, and he says, "Today you will be with me in paradise," right? So you can see Luke's an optimist.
Yeah.
Luke's character of Jesus, and I think all of them are true. I think all of them have merit. They're adjusting for their audience. In the Venn diagram of people who were Jewish and people who are now Christian, Matthew is in the middle of that, right? People who are Jewish Christian, and Luke is in people who are outside of that Jewish Christian, people who are Gentile Christian, so a Greek audience. So Luke's gospel is written for Greeks. And one of the things that I always love to bring up, do you know the story, Nathan, of lowering the man down into the roof to be healed by Jesus?
Yeah, the paralyzed man.
The paralyzed man. There's too many people in the house, and they lower him through the roof. If you look at that story in Matthew, and then you look at that story in Luke, there's one difference, and it's what the roof was made out of. So in Matthew, the people pull apart straw, and they drop Jesus in. It's like 3 little pigs, right? But in the Luke version, they move the tiles out of the way and drop them in. Why? Because the audience is Greek, and Greek people have tile roofs, right? So you can't get away from thinking of your audience when you're writing. Even though they're changing what Jesus looks like or talks like, now he's Greek, right?
Yeah.
It's all written in Greek. He doesn't speak Aramaic or something like that in Luke's gospel. And then you get to John.
Yeah, so John is, of course, the black sheep of the Gospels.
Right.
Mark starts with Jesus' baptism. John starts with the beginning of time.
That's right. Right. So Mark starts with the baptism. Matthew starts with the birth and the commentary through Joseph. And then, actually, Matthew starts with the lineage all the way back to David, right? All the way back to Abraham. And then Luke comes along, he starts the baptism, then he gives a lineage all the way back to Adam, right?
Yeah.
So we're sort of, as we go this way in time, we're going this way into history. And then by the time we get to John, John is the dreamer. If Matthew's a realist and if Mark is a realist, Matthew's a pessimist, Luke is an optimist, John is the dreamer. He's not trying to tell a synoptic story. He's trying to weave together more poetry than prose. He is the William Shakespeare of this group, okay? So he uses a word, and then later he'll weave that word back in. Grace is a word that he uses a lot. And in chapter 2, he says, grace upon grace, which is like an overflowing. Your cup is overflowing. John has a lot of imagery of Psalm 23 in it. John has a lot of Lamb of God, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' ministry takes 1 year, and John's, it takes 3. And that's because John is rewriting all of the ancient festival days. So imagine if Jesus came today and he told you, here's a new way to do Reformation Day, here's a new way to do Easter, here's a new way to do Christmas, right? He does that in John. He goes to the Festival of Lights, which is Hanukkah, you know, the menorah, and he says, I am the light of the world, right? And then he goes to Passover, and rather than being down in the temple where he's supposed to be, he's way up north, and he gives food to 6,000 people, and he says, I am the bread of life, right? So theologically, he's dreaming. He's in this whole other echelon of how we talk about
So 2 questions
ministry.
about
Yeah.
this. So who is John writing for, and how are we supposed to read John?
Yeah, I think John is the most beautiful thing that's ever been written. And I've read a lot of Shakespeare because I was a theater major, right? That's what we do. I think John is really the Shakespeare of this group. I think it should be read the way you would read Shakespeare. You don't read King Richard, right, in Shakespeare and think, oh, this is a historical account. You're like, okay, there's a historical figure under this, and then it's been developed to give you a mindset for what it would be like, right, to say some of those lines, right, or Julius Caesar. That's probably a better example, right? Et tu, Brute, right?
Yeah.
All of that happens in the Shakespearean play is like giving it more flesh, giving it more substance, giving it more oomph. And John's really beautiful about that. If you look at biblical scholars, if you took all the biblical scholars of Gospels and put them in a room together, it'd be a big room. And then you would say, okay, the people who wrote your PhD in your area of expertise is Mark. Go stand over here. There'd be this many, right? And they would all be into social justice. And then Matthew, there'd be even fewer. And then Luke, there'd be a lot. And then John would be half the room. So most gospel people, theologians, love John. There are so many great John scholars out there. I could talk about John forever. I plan to teach John in fall of 2021.
So coming up soon.
Coming up soon. Yep.
Okay, so after the Gospels,
Yep.
we have Acts.
We have Acts. So Acts is the second act. It's the sequel to Luke.
Yeah.
That's going to be really important to you when you get to seminary.
Good that you brought this up, because Peggy Hoffer wanted to ask if you tend to tie in Acts after the Gospel of Luke as two books in one.
That's right. So they didn't know what to do with John because it didn't fit with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But they didn't know how to keep Luke next to Acts, because Luke and Acts is chapter 1 and chapter 2, without putting John somewhere. So they put John in the middle, which was dumb. But what they're trying to do is de-emphasize John. They believe that the very first thing you read is the most important. So when they put the Bible together in 333, they put Matthew first, because they're like, this has an in crowd and an out crowd. The early church was really into that, right? They were like, this has a lineage, this has a lot of this ancient prophecy, so we can be mad at the Jewish people for not realizing that Jesus is the Messiah. There's some anti-Semitism in that choice. So they wanted to put John last of the Gospels so that you could believe it less, okay? But it does slice up Luke and Acts. Luke and Acts are both addressed to the same person. So Luke was a professional writer. He wrote in about 75 or 80 AD, and he addresses the letter to Theophilus. Theo, which means God, and Philos, which means love. So it's like, you who loves God, right? Dear lover of God, okay? Or beloved of God. So he's addressing probably a patron. A rich dude paid him to write this gospel down, okay? Acts is the story of the early church. And I asked you for this picture of the temple because it actually starts in the temple. So in Matthew's gospel, it's more Jewish in origin, but in Luke's gospel, it's more temple-focused as a symbol of who Jesus is. So for instance, it's in Luke's gospel, when he's 12 years old, that he goes and his mom finds him in the temple. His story starts in the temple. It's in Luke's gospel when, right after he's born, they go to the temple and they meet Anna and Simeon, right? And he's dedicated at the temple when he's a baby. And it's in Acts where Paul, who is sort of the next Jesus, right? In the story of Acts, at least, Paul starts his ministry at the temple. So it's also remembering the temple because the temple had been destroyed, like sort of like a 9/11 moment for them, was when the temple was destroyed. That happened right before Luke and Matthew wrote. So they have this nostalgia about the temple, the way they write. Acts is the story of the early church. It's got some really interesting, it's a good read. Is it trying to be historical? I would put it right in the middle of this is like definitely historical and this is fiction. It's trying to be in the middle. It's trying to be an exaggerated sort of, it's a tale. It's a tale. It's a tale of Peter and in the story of Pentecost in chapter 2. It's a story of Stephen, the martyr who was stoned to death. It's a story of Peter and the sheet, which is when he decides that they can eat the food of the Gentiles and all those things. So Acts is a good read, and I encourage you to read that one.
So I have a question. Going back a little bit, still talking about the Gospels, Dan and Dawn asked if we can speak about Jesus being portrayed as divine in John's Gospel versus as a suffering servant in Mark.
Yes. My only hesitation is time, but absolutely. So we would call that John is a high Christology. which means that Jesus is almost floating above the ground, right? Mark's version of that, because it's like immediately, is a lower Christology, where Jesus is more like walking in the dirt, okay? That doesn't mean that Mark has a lesser view of Jesus. It simply means that the version of Jesus that he likes to tell is more Jesus than Christ, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the story that John likes to tell is more Christ than Jesus. It's more symbolic in origin. Again, it doesn't mean that either one didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus. It means that the way if they were making a movie of it, Mark's Jesus would be a lot dirtier, and John's Jesus would be a lot more clean with glowing eyes.
Well, and that's why it's good we have these
More
different
special
perspectives
effects.
from the
Yeah.
Gospels so we can understand that Jesus is fully human and fully divine,
Yep,
because
Exactly.
it's hard to portray that simultaneously.
exactly.
Okay, let's jump forward just so we have enough time to Romans. Oop, jumped forward.
Yep, so the other way that they put books together is by the size. So whenever they get to a bunch of books and they don't know what order to put them in, they put the biggest one first. But that's kind of dumb, because Romans is the last thing Paul writes. This is his coup de grace. It's his gospel. It's his best writing. Romans is such a great read. I encourage you to read it. If you struggle in chapter 3, just move to chapter 6. Because 3, 4, and 5 is like all about law and like how you prove things in court. And then when he gets to 6, he's like, and then Jesus died for you. And then when he gets to 8, he's like, for I am convinced that there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. And then when he gets to 12, and then 9, 10, and 11, we think we're later and we're kind of put in the middle. But the beginning of 9 really flows naturally into chapter 12. And chapter 12 is that beautiful saying,
My favorite.
of do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then it says, we all have spiritual gifts. And then it says, Romans 12:9 says, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good, rejoice with those who rejoice, and mourn with those who mourn. So Romans is this beautiful treatise on how you should live a Christian life. So what's cool about it is he's not writing to a church that he already knows, like he is with Corinthians and some of those other things, where he's like, y'all are screwing up, stop screwing up. To Rome, he's like, hey, I know y'all have a church out there, and I've never been there, so I'm going to write you this so that you'll maybe send me money and I'll be there.
Yeah.
As theologian Lily and Daniel would say, he loves God so much he's willing to be paid for his work.
Now, how do we read Romans? Because Romans has such a diversity of like tone. He can be Paul can be very condemning at certain points.
Yeah.
And very inclusive at other points, and that's why Paul sometimes gets a lot of flack for his writing.
Yeah, I think Paul knows. I think he knows he's going to die when he writes Romans. There's some suggestion that he actually finished writing it in captivity, like on death row. I think that he knows that this is going to be his coup de grace, his final symphony. This is his final thing. So it becomes really epic, and that means that the stakes are raised. So it can feel judgmental at times because there's such high stakes. But the culmination of everything he says is in Romans 8. There's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. And then in Romans 12, those things are the most important things Paul ever wrote. And I think Paul would back that up.
Yeah, so let's continue on to 1st and 2nd Corinthians.
So if we were going historically, we would start with 1 Thessalonians. That's really the first thing he writes. And then he starts writing 1st and 2nd Corinthians. This is what we're going to study this fall, upcoming here at Christ King. So really excited about that. Hopefully the world opens back up and we can be back in this room and fill up the room again. 1st and 2nd Corinthians are really great treatises. In 1 Corinthians, I want to say it's in chapter 5, he makes reference to another letter that he wrote them, which we don't have. He actually says it was a letter of sorrow. So arguably the 1 Corinthians we have is actually 2 Corinthians, and what we call 2 Corinthians is actually 3 Corinthians. But the first letter was so scathing that they threw it away. So here's what happens. Paul goes around and he starts a church, and things go well. And then as soon as he leaves and turns his back, everything descends into madness. So it's a little bit, these letters, these epistles are like spinning tops. And as soon as, or spinning plates, you know what I'm talking about? And he spins a plate, and then he walks away to work on another plate, and then it starts to wobble.
Can you talk about what an epistle is?
Yeah. So there's a lot of debate about whether or not Paul is writing letters or epistles, okay? A letter is a one-on-one correspondence of, this is me caring for you, Nathan, as an individual. Mm-hmm. An epistle is like a rhetorical document, like a letter to the editor, okay? Think about the difference between the Declaration of Independence and just a regular letter to somebody, okay? The Declaration of Independence is meant to not just be addressed to King George, but to everyone. You see what I'm saying? It's like a source, like an open letter, like Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which is an open letter. Luther's 95 Theses, by the time he publishes them, is an open letter, okay? So the epistles are meant not just as letters, but as this open form. And think about this, Nathan. I just found this out like my last year in seminary. This blew my mind. Nobody read to themselves until about the year 1000. So if you could read, you read it out loud. It never even occurred to them to read silently until they became monks. Did you know that?
No.
So if you're going to write a letter to somebody, it was meant to be proclaimed. So he would write this letter, and 1 Corinthians is stop messing up. And then 2 Corinthians is, I love you. Stop messing up. So there's a little bit of that. For 1 Corinthians, there's a lot of great language, and we'll save some of that for the fall. But 1 Corinthians 15 is the part I really want to lift up to you. I think if you're watching this and you're looking for a word of hope, I would read 1 Corinthians 15. We shall not all die, but we will all be changed in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye. We will be resurrected on the last day. There's just really great language. So be constant, steadfast, and immovable. We shall all be changed. I just think that's really great language for us right now. 1 Corinthians 15.
So let's move on to Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. We're running low on time, so we got to keep it to Cliff Notes.
Yeah, so here's the Cliff Notes. If you want to memorize these in order, God eats potato chips. That's how we memorize it in seminary.
Potato chips.
There was a lot of question about which of these Paul actually wrote. I think Paul definitely wrote Galatians and Philippians and Colossians. Ephesians is on the fence. I think he probably didn't write Ephesians, or he wrote a little bit of it, and somebody else wrote the majority of it, particularly because it references things that are outside of his time, okay? We know when he was killed in about 80, so it feels like it's a little bit later than that. These are all great pastoral letters. These are more churches and spinning plates, right, that he's writing to. There's a lot of great stuff in that. Philippians 4:13, everyone knows. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Colossians has some really great pastoral stuff. Ephesians 2, 8, 9, and 10. For it is by grace we have been saved through faith. That's a huge one for Luther. So I commend those two. These are all great reads, and they're really pastoral in their approach, and I think they'd be really helpful in this time also.
Okay, and next we have 1 and 2.
Especially
Thessalonians.
Ephesians. 1 Thessalonians is the first thing that Paul writes. Paul's conversion is in the late 30s, and then by the time we get to the year 52, he's writing his first letter, and it's 1 Thessalonians. This is the church that he wrote to in Thessalonica, which is the first place we're going to visit when we go to Greece next year. So excited about that. And then 1 and 2 Timothy are letters written to Timothy. There's a question about whether or not Paul wrote these. There's a question about Paul's relationship to Timothy. You should just know this, Nathan, if you're going to teach queer Bible. There's some question about the relationship between these two. It was well known in the Greco-Roman world that men often had a boy that wasn't their biological child, but someone that they loved and often had a romantic relationship with. And there are a lot of scholars who suggest that Paul has this. Paul does not write about being married. Actually, he tells people not to get married, right? He is anti-marriage all the way. But then he says, in this letter to 1 Timothy, how great it is to have a son and to not have to have raised him, basically. How great is it to have you, someone I can love? So, their relationship is very intimate, let's just say. So I just thought that was worth noting there. I wouldn't read 1st and 2nd Timothy. Yeah, 1st Timothy, I would read 1 Thessalonians before I read 1st and 2nd Timothy, if you were just a casual reader.
Okay, and then next we have Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, and James.
So these four, I've put someone in chains like a prisoner. Philemon is my favorite book. It's out of these sort of lesser-known ones. And it's a story about a slave who ran away. And the slave's name is Onesimus. And he runs to Paul and says, hey, Paul, I ran away from my slave master. Will you write him a letter and tell him to just let me go? So he writes a letter to Philemon, who is the slave owner, and says, I have him here, and actually he's here taking care of me, which is actually your job, Philemon. You're supposed to be here taking care of me. So why don't we just consider Onesimus to be working in your stead? And maybe you should actually even pay him for being here and bringing me food every day. Because they didn't have prison meals. The only way you got food was when somebody brought it to you, all right? So that's pretty funny. James is worth mentioning because Luther hated the book of James.
Yeah, a question on that from Peggy. Conservatives tend to hang on the book of James's good deeds and appropriate Christian behavior writings. How should we Lutherans embrace the book of James?
It's funny that you mentioned that as conservatives because if they really understood what James was, they would hate it. James is like, imagine that you're in a prison house. You're in a slave quarters, okay? And the master's house is up on the hill, all right? Mm-hmm. And you speak loud enough that they can hear you, okay? They're like, you should know that your good work honors God. Having faith without hard work does not honor God. It is like straw, okay? So you should work really hard. And what they're really saying, it's a commentary on slavery. It's a commentary that the slaves are making about their slave masters by saying good work should be honored, okay? So if conservatives really knew that, they would not like, it's really antithetical. But what they pick up on is, there's a line that says, those who don't work shouldn't get food. And conservatives have mined that to say, the government shouldn't be part of handouts. But actually what James is saying is the slave owners who do nothing but whip us, they shouldn't get the food from the harvest, right? Because they didn't sow the seed, they didn't plant the seed, they didn't harvest the seed. The slaves did, right? So that's just a riot to me that people are really bad. The people who call themselves literalists literally do the worst literal reading of the Bible sometimes.
So moving on, we have 1st and 2nd Peter next.
Yeah, we can blow through 1st and 2nd Peter. I think they're pretty good reads. I'd put them maybe on that third list. They're pastoral letters. These are much later. These are like 150 years after Jesus. So sometimes these pastorals get attributed to Paul, but it doesn't share any of his language. It would be like if somebody read or listened to 10 of Pastor Wolfgang's sermons and then used like some of his regular words and then wrote some stuff. But it doesn't have the iambic pentameter, it doesn't have the diction, it doesn't have the gravitas of Paul. So we think that they're just good pastoral, they're like sermons. Yeah.
Okay, and finally, the last 5 books of the Bible.
Yeah, people always want to talk about Revelation, and I put a lamb here because the Lamb of God. Okay, so imagine that you have this Gospel of John, and we've already said the Gospel of John is this totally dreamer thing, okay? And then there's a school for dreamers, okay? We'll call it California Berkeley, okay? And in this school of dreamers, they start putting out pastors who are all hippie types, okay? And the hippie types later on write down their dreams in the style of the Gospel of John, who's already a dreamer. But the Gospel of John has a lot to do with the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That's a line from the Gospel of John. So 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are references back to that Gospel of John, and they're all about how Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And then by the time you get to Revelation, you realize that this is a poem about what the restoration of the world will look like. So it really bothers me when people say that Revelation is about the end of the world, when it literally isn't. The last thing that happens in Revelation 21 is that God builds a new Jerusalem. It's not about the world being destroyed in Armageddon. It's about starting over in the world. It's about God being on the throne. It's about what would happen if we lived in God's kingdom and not a kingdom run by me or you or this tyrant or that tyrant, right? It's not about somebody wielding absolute power. It's everyone submitting to the common good, to love and grace, and knowing that sacrificial love is the most powerful thing in the universe. That's what Revelation's actually about. It's not about destruction. It's about a love that transcends all that. So,
Yeah. What about Jude?
Yeah, Jude's like a one-page pastoral epistle also. It sort of falls in here because it's a much later story than these others. And so it sort of belongs in the same sort of category. But it doesn't quite have the same theology of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Revelation. So it's just another sort of pastoral.
Okay, we have to wrap up.
Yeah.
I'm going to fire off 2 questions for you.
Great.
Randy wanted to ask, isn't Paul's conversion one of the highlights of Acts?
Yes, Paul's conversion is a highlight of Acts. If we're on the spectrum of this is historical and this is a figurative or a metaphor story, the conversion of Acts is right in the middle. The conversion of Paul in Acts is right in the middle. And the reason I say that is because Paul never tells his story that way. Only Acts tells the story of Paul that way. Mm-hmm. So Acts has some citing of Paul. So think about Luke is writing Acts. Luke's history is a little bit off. It's off by about 3 years on several occasions, okay? So in the beginning of Luke's gospel, we have this whole thing when Quirinius was governor of Syria, right? You know, that whole thing in the beginning of the birth narrative. Those, like the 3 people that he lists are in charge, don't overlap in terms of when they were actually in charge. Mm-hmm. So we always question the historicity of Luke's fact-finding. He's trying really hard, and the things aren't written down, so it's all oral tradition. So yes, the conversion of Paul, of Saul into Paul, is somewhere in between historical and a legend that's been developed. So did it probably happen something very similar to that? Yes. But Paul doesn't give an eyewitness account of that. Luke does.
And final question from Cindy. She was wondering how teaching the Bible in seminary has changed over time. The symbolism and types of writing are newer ideas. People might not have heard of them before.
Yes. I can only speak for the Lutheran tradition, but if you look up something called Seminex, seminary with an X on the end, there was a time when, don't quote me on this, I want to say it was like 1970, and there was a time when a bunch of pastors started saying, wait a second, when we apply the work of the Enlightenment era to our scriptural understanding, when we overlay those, remember, you're too young to have, did you have like class projectors?
Yes.
Okay, and projectors, like you could take 2 things and lay them over top. Mm-hmm. When they laid both of those things over top, what filtered through was a way to read scripture. And the way it was taught to me was when the Bible is being read from a pulpit on Sunday, it is sacred scripture. But when it's being read in a classroom, it's like every other book in the library. And we need to be able to offer it historiocritical understanding. So Cindy's right. When we look at the things that we don't think Paul wrote anymore, that all started to change during that Seminex time, at least in the Lutheran faith. The Moravians were ahead of us by 100 years, but they usually are. Mm-hmm. In the Lutheran faith, that changed a lot in the 70s, where pastors started to say, wait a second, if I don't check my brain at the door, but if I use my brain, this doesn't look like Paul quite the same way. I know at the top it says written by Paul, but the language is different. And a lot of that comes with the use of technology, because if your group of monks, and there's 10 of you, can talk to 10 other monks somewhere else who are looking at the same text, and then you start to put together outsourcing and what is that called? Crowdsourcing, okay? Crowdsourcing means that you can look at a text and I can look at a text, and then you establish databases where I can then search pseuderoepigraphal, which is the word that means not an epistle. So an epistle is something Paul wrote. Pseuderoepigraphal means not really or close to, but not an epistle. So pseuderoepigraphal, if I search that up, then we can look at common words, and then we can put into a dictionary how many times is the word grace used in any document. And now I can search that on my computer, and it'll tell me, in Ephesians, it's used like 10 times. And in 2 Timothy, it's used 0 times. And then we think, oh, maybe Paul didn't write that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So technology really gives rise to that in a new way. Carbon dating and archaeology help a lot too.
Well, thank you so much for going through everything with us. We are out of time for this morning. If you want to learn more, of course, we will have a Bible study in the fall going over 1st and 2nd Corinthians.
Yeah, I really covet your emails too. If you've got a question you'd like to talk about something, we're getting a little lonely out here. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and walking through the Bible. Again, this is like a college 101 first day introduction. Anything you want to go deeper on, if you want to read a book of the Bible or something, just hit me up. We'd love to talk to you about that. Peace, y'all. Come back for worship.
See you in a bit.
Bye.